Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Morrison, and I am an organization development consultant with the Learning and Organizational Development Unit. And I'd like to welcome you all in this morning to ACEL2 Extension. As you can see on the screen this morning, we will have effective questioning strategies with Dr. Shannon Washburn. Thank you very much for being here today. Before we jump deep into the topic, I did want to drop our web page in the chat box so that you can find information on the series, which has been a wonderful partnership. We've received a lot of great anecdotal feedback and also feedback and surveys from everyone. So we're glad that you've been enjoying this, but it's been a wonderful partnership. Myself and Beth Flynn, who you see on here with the OSU Leadership Center and ACEL, that have been planning this, and we've had all of our ACEL faculty involved to help provide us the session, so we're appreciative of that. So thank you. We have one more session for this current series, which will happen in May, and then we'll take a bit of a break over the summer and kick it back up in the fall. So you'll also be able to find all the recordings on that web page as well from the previous couple series. So make sure to head there to see some of the past things. So we will go ahead and jump right in so we can stay on schedule. And we have, again, effective questioning strategies. And thank you, Dr. Washburn, who's a professor and chair of the ACEL department, to lead us through this morning. So thanks, Shannon.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you all for making the time and effort to join us this morning, and really thank you for your involvement throughout the ACEL2 Extension series. I recognize several faces and names from previous sessions that I've done, and I'm just thrilled at the partnership that we have, and look forward to building on that. Jared didn't mention that I'm in month 10 in my role as chair, so still learning very much about OSU Extension and OSU in general. So it's a pleasure to have some time with you this morning to talk about a subject that I really enjoy teaching in person. And I have to admit right up front, I have really struggled at how to adapt this presentation for Zoom. And part of that is so much of what I know and do as a presenter, especially when presenting in person, is based on feedback that I get from the participants in the room. And so for that reason, and I'm sure many of you are the same, I'm going to ask that if at all possible, if it's not a bandwidth issue, if it's not I'm eating breakfast while participating sort of situation, if you could turn on your cameras, I would really, really appreciate having a little bit of facial reaction from the participants so that I can see who you are and how you're reacting. That is just such an important aspect of knowing when a question is called for. So if we were doing this in person, I would have a lot of opportunity for you to kind of pause and think about where in an upcoming presentation might you want to think about applying these concepts. And I'm going to try to incorporate some of those ideas in what we do this morning, because I think the purpose of this entire ACEL2 Extension series is to share some ideas, and I will encourage you to share ideas with one another during our time together this morning, but also to think about how can I change practice? Ultimately, that's why I think you probably chose to participate this morning. You're looking for some ideas or maybe a new way to approach your own instruction. So with that background, we'll go ahead and jump in here. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions during this session, believe it or not. So what I'm going to ask of you is that you really try to practice engagement. We're going to use the chat, and I will encourage you to answer questions as I ask them. I do not mind at all if you jump in and unmute and just shout something out for the group. That's completely fine. But what I'm going to encourage you to do ultimately is give yourself permission here to take an hour and think about how to refine your craft. I am in no way the expert on questioning strategies. I've spent a lot of time thinking about and working with pre-service and in-service teachers on these topics, but give yourself this hour to really think about what you can do differently in a future engagement opportunity. Another thing that I would ask you to do is share your thoughts as we go. We all know that a community of learners is more effective than one person presenting. So please jump in and share those ideas as you have them. And ultimately, jot down some thoughts and try to practice some of the concepts that I'll try to share to elicit some brain activity from all of you. So those are the things that I would ask of you this morning. And what you can expect from me are the following. We're going to take a look at really kind of thinking about how does the brain react to a situation when a question is posed by a presenter in a learning environment. We're going to take a look at some of the concepts of different forms of questions. And I'm going to try to share some strategies with you with an assumption that, well, with a couple of assumptions, actually. One assumption is that you want to get better at asking questions in an instructional environment. And another assumption is that you agree with me, and this isn't a question, I want you to know the position that I take, and that is that questions are a basic fundamental of human interaction with one another. You bump into somebody in the grocery store that you haven't seen in a long time, that conversation really is a series of questions that we ask one another to gather information. And so it is a basic fundamental of human communication. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that if we want our instructional engagement opportunities to truly be engaging and to feel conversational, they need to include a lot of questions. And so those are some assumptions that I bring. And the third assumption that I bring to this session is that you really are looking for ways to more effectively engage the learners that you work with. And I would purport to you that questions are a good way to make that happen. And so we're going to move into the very first question that I'm going to pose to you as a group. What are some reasons, and not repeating what I just said, what are some reasons why you want to ask questions in the instructional environments that you have led in the past? What are your reasons for using questions?
Checking for understanding.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Ken.
To stimulate thinking.
Yeah. If you want your learners really to think, questions are a great way to do that. I see audience engagement. Engaging the audience. Awesome. Yeah, Carrie, thanks. Keeping you engaged. Right. Exactly. Engagement and understanding. Yeah. Keep this coming. To see where people are. Absolutely. So that check for understanding, and that can happen really effectively at the beginning of a presentation, kind of like I'm doing now, just to kind of see where the audience is. But those questions that are intended to check for understanding can work really effectively after some new content has been presented and before we move on, right? Yeah, so find out what the audience already knows, great. Reiterate what you're saying. Yeah, to encourage curiosity. Thanks, Jared. Help participants realize what they already know. Yeah. Misty, thank you for sharing that one too. Questions are also a way to build community within the audience. And Kristen points out the same thing so that people get to know one another. Great, thank you for those. And that's kind of where we are going. here's what I want to challenge you to think with me on. Yeah, deeper thinking. Man, they keep rolling in. Wonderful. I want to encourage you to put yourself into the shoes of the learner, which is probably why you showed up today, I suppose. But I want you to think about what happens for us mentally when a presenter poses a question to the group. Okay. So first of all, let's go back just a few seconds. I posed a question to you a little bit ago. There was about 30 seconds or so, maybe 15, before the first responses started rolling in on chat. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, right? Our brains need time to process the question, to think about, okay, what do I think of this? Do I have something intelligent to share? Am I comfortable putting myself out there and sharing what's on my mind? And that takes time. One of the fundamental challenges with questioning strategies is to give people time to process the question in order to think about the answer. And so one of the things that is really helpful in that dynamic is really thinking about planning questions ahead of time as a presenter. And here's why I suggest that, because we have mental processes as presenters too. When questions are thrown out there just off the top of your head, and I'm not saying you should never do that, because I think in the moment questions can be very effective as well. But when we have thought about a question and we make the decision as the presenter, I'm just going to throw this one out there. A lot of times it's easy to be nervous about, oh my gosh, is that a dumb question? Did they understand it? Why is nobody saying anything? And I think that's especially true on Zoom, right? We think a lot about, are they gonna say, is anybody gonna jump in here? And we've all experienced that, right? So sometimes, especially if you're a more nervous presenter, planning some questions out ahead of time is a good way to help you make sure you give people the wait time that they need. But the other thing to remember here is that our participants plan questions too. And they need time to do that as well. So let me share an example here. In the last few weeks, my department has been involved in interviewing candidates for a new faculty position. And we've done the typical seminar that the candidates shared with the group. And I find myself, when I'm listening to a seminar for a scenario like that, Beth, great strategy for that wait time thing. We'll get back to that in a little bit. I find myself, when I'm listening to a candidate seminar, I'm spending as much time thinking about what question do I want to ask, because I know there's a Q&A period coming up at the end. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And it is easy to get distracted from the presentation because I'm really thinking so much about what question do I want to ask to sound intelligent. That's an important thing for us to remember as presenters too, that our participants are usually in the process of thinking about, how do I feel about this new content? What are my reactions to this? How can I use this? Is this valuable to me at all? So keep in mind that your participants are also regularly thinking about questions they want to ask. And most of us are too polite to just jump in and blurt out a question as it hits us. So what I'm leading to here is that it's important as a presenter to plan time for participants to ask questions too. And the reason for that, well, I just shared a lot of reasons, but an additional reason is that when we use a lot of questions in our presentation, we set up a culture where we make it more conversational, And participants want to ask questions too, because in our human interactions, we're not accustomed to only answering questions outside of an interview, right? We're accustomed to that give and take. So when we use a lot of questions as a presenter, we need to plan in time for participants to share their questions too. So let me stop right there and ask you a question. What questions are you hoping we will address during our time together this morning? You decided to come to this workshop probably because you had something intentional that you wanted to learn. What is one of those things that you hope we will address today? If you'd rather ask verbally, that's fine too. Okay, so how to word questions effectively? Great, we're going to definitely talk about that, Carrie. Please keep those questions coming as we move forward, and I will make sure that we have time for those as we go. Another mental mechanic, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar. Here they come. Here they come. How to question when those in the room are elected officials. Yeah. Great concern there, Gwen. Very specific concern. When there is a strange power dynamic in the audience, it is a delicate situation to think about creating an environment where a lot of questions are flowing back and forth. Let me think on that one a little bit. So techniques on breaking down big complex questions into smaller manageable questions. Excellent. Travis, how to get youth to respond in a virtual setting. Wow, Travis, when we crack that nut, we'll be millionaires, won't we? Yeah, I've experienced the same thing. And I'll say it's not just youth. You know, the virtual setting situation is hard for all of us. And I am not the expert on that strategy, other than the more engaging we can be, the more likely it is that they will participate. But that's not always the case with everybody. So thank you for sharing those questions, and please keep them coming. One of the things that I'm sure you have heard about before is wait time. I want to talk to you about wait time 1 and wait time 2. How many of you have thought about the fact that there are 2 different types of wait time? For those of you who haven't thought about wait time before, and Beth mentioned earlier, when we ask a question, providing the audience time to answer the question or to think about what questions they have, that's wait time 1. So I pose a question, I need to wait, and we've talked about that already. Wait time 2 is also an important aspect of encouraging people to ask more questions. Wait time 2 is the time that we give ourselves to process the response before responding as the presenter. So I will share with you that I struggle with this. So Ken answers a question. I say, great, Ken, that's great. Thank you for participating. Because one of the things that my brain says to do is to try to offer the praise and the reward for the participation. But if we're not careful, we can come across as looking as if we are not actually processing the response. So it's okay as the presenter to visually and audibly provide that silence to process the response to the question before responding with some kind of feedback. And that's wait time 2. And it usually is not as long, doesn't have to be as long, but you can really encourage more participation and more people asking and answering questions when you show them that as the presenter, you actually are contemplating what they contributed to the discussion. So those are a couple of thoughts to ponder related to the mental processes. Earlier, I think it was Carrie who asked a question about what are some ways to phrase questions that will be more effective? And that's really a bulk of what I want to share with you. Oh, Stephanie, great question. Would you suggest repeating the question out loud during wait time too? So to me, that depends, Stephanie. If someone has responded, and it depends a lot on the question as well. If someone has responded and you're picking up visual cues that other people didn't grasp the question, then I think that is a case where it is valuable to repeat the question and say, you know, my question was X, the response was this. What do the rest of you think? And then process that response after wait time too. So yeah, Stephanie, I do think there are times when there is a purpose in that. But if it's very clear that everybody understood the question, now if it's a youth audience, this might be different as well. A youth audience might need to have a reminder of what the question was, just for the purpose of repetition. So I think there's a lot of cases where that can be valuable. So thinking about some examples here of strategies for asking questions. And forgive me, I know that not all of us work with students. I just recognized on my very first example that I did not replace the word students with the word learners. I prefer learners, especially with an extension audience. But really, the idea here is make sure your questions are specific. So an example, encouraging people to use their own words is a good way to encourage responses, rather than, because that addresses that mental block of, do I really have something that's going to sound intelligent when I contribute? So encouraging them to use their own words to describe a situation or a concept that they've used. Encouraging them to ask their own questions, encouraging your learners to ask questions. And you can do that by structuring cues that help your learners formulate questions that maybe they don't understand. So if you're presenting on a particular topic, and you stop and just ask, are there any questions? A lot of times, out of courtesy to each other, you know, nobody wants to be the roadblock that slows down the show, right? So when we ask the question, are there any questions? Oddly enough, we rarely get any questions with that sort of question. But instead, we can think about who has questions about how we would apply this concept in a real world context, right? So giving them cues. Yeah, so yeah, Becky, thanks. I like to ask that too. What questions do you have? Another form of that is, what questions are there? So basically the assumption that questions are out there is behind that type of wording, but really kind of structuring the direction of where the question might come from can be helpful. Another way to really encourage people to ask questions is to present a problem or a situation that really asks them to apply the new ideas, and then say, let's put this into practice. So with this example, we've been talking about financial budgeting for quite a while now. What are some thoughts that you have about how financial budgeting might reduce some stress in your life? Where would you really benefit from living with a financial budget? So just asking folks or giving them permission to share the applications that they've come up with. Okay, a couple more here. One of the things that can be helpful as well is just really use those nonverbals to find out, do people need a question? Are they tracking with what's happening? And things like looking for puzzled expressions, noticing on Zoom that everybody's kind of disappeared from the screen is probably a clue that they've tuned out. Some of those types of things as well. And as easy as it is to think about yes or no response questions, they're not a natural part of the conversation usually. In most of our conversational approaches, we don't just barrage one another with yes, no type questions. But for some reason in educational settings, a natural reaction as a presenter to just throw a question in would be to use more of a yes, no response. And those usually don't encourage a lot of participation. So making sure the question is clear, avoiding things like, what did I say or what was discussed, but instead think about something that really utilizes the information and encourages participants to apply the concepts in their question or in their response. One last piece here, and then I'm gonna take another break here. Yeah, yes, are there any questions? Is in fact, thank you, Ken, is in fact itself a yes or no question. Here's a classic case, and I know all of us have been in a situation like this, where we've either been the learner or we've been the presenter, and we've done this guess what I'm thinking sort of scenario. So the presenter says, what's the symptom of nutrient deficiency? One of the audience members says, well, leaf size reduction. And the presenter says, yeah, what else? And that might be a good strategy to get additional responses. So brown spotting, yeah, what else? Intervenal chlorosis. Yeah, I'm thinking of a different one. You know, those kinds of things. And then we finally get to the, oh yeah, that's the one that I was looking for. That is a wonderful way to shut your audience down, because you have, with that sort of dynamic, you have set yourself up as the expert with one thing on their mind who is not open to the input from the group, right? Because each one of those potential responses is probably appropriate and accurate in my scenario here. But when the presenter is looking for a specific thing, but they're not phrasing the question in such a way that gives a cue that that's the thing they're looking for, it's a way to shut down, unintentionally to shut down the audience. And then finally, try really hard to not phrase a question that includes the one correct answer. So, you know, don't we all agree that integrated pest management is the best way or the best strategy to control whitefly? Well, there's 1,000 ways to control whitefly, but that don't we all agree is saying, well, that's clearly what you think is the right response. So who am I to disagree as a lowly member of the audience here, right? So, you know, avoid using those questions that kind of hint to what you believe to be the true or correct response. Okay. Who has, I've got a question for you now. Who has an example of how questions can be effective at the beginning of a presentation? What would you use questions at the beginning of a presentation to accomplish? And verbal responses here are fine. You don't feel like you have to chat.
What is something you want to learn today?
Excellent. Yeah. So Gwen, thank you. That where are you going, or what was your motivation to attend? Thanks. Casey says, asking what people hope to learn. Katie, thank you. Connection before content. So forming that that relationship with questions at the beginning before presenting a bunch of new content is great. And Katie, I really love that language connection before content. Other reasons to ask questions at the beginning of a session.
We sometimes just ask, how are you feeling? How are you feeling today? Just to get a gauge of, are they worn out before you start? Or they?
Yeah, and Gwen, talk some more about why you take that approach.
Well, especially if we're teaching on a Friday, that's that's a good leading, you know, just to kind of talk about the week for a minute, that connection, plus you kind of know how they feel and if they're geared up and ready, or you maybe need to take it slow for a while at the beginning.
And that does give you some clues as a presenter of what kind of pacing do I need to follow here. Great. 9 o'clock on a Thursday, I would say, is pretty close to a Friday session as well.
I think you can establish tone or atmosphere of the presentation to let people know that it's okay to question, it's okay to participate, it's actually encouraged.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Really setting the stage for the fact that this is going to be a conversational exchange. Awesome. So why would you use questions in the middle of the session?
I think you might ask questions to maybe get more clarity about what they heard you say, or to make sure that you're hearing what it is that they're intending to say. And then maybe to challenge some thinking for problem solving or something.
Becky, thank you. And I know you do a lot of facilitation that is, I'm certain, structured around a lot of questions. I really should have you presenting this session rather than participating. Thanks for throwing that in. Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of see where is their understanding. And Andrea, thank you. Pausing in the middle of a presentation and giving folks an opportunity to ask or answer questions is a great way to ramp up engagement again. Engaging a different part of their brain so that they can tune back in a little bit more. Great. Checking for clarity. Those are the types of things. Travis, you unmuted.
Yeah, so it kind of relates to what I put in the chat box, but I guess I use that time sometimes in the middle as a way, and I think it hits some of those things to kind of go back and maybe mention a concept or two that I've already covered for those people that are sort of like, oh, I thought about a question, but now it's 3 minutes past where really we are talking about that sort of point of information. So sometimes I use that time to try to strategize a question that might allow those people the opportunity where they feel like, okay, now's the time when I can ask that, versus sometimes if it's like, well, at the end we'll have Q&A, it's like, well, if I don't write it down, I might not remember what that question is 60 minutes from now. So
that's exactly right, Travis. And I love that you mentioned kind of that circling back to prior content to maybe use that question to review and catch people up, as well as setting the stage for opening the door for them to ask a question. Great. Gwen, yeah, polls with a virtual environment, using polls as a midpoint, and it wouldn't have to just be in a virtual setting, but polling your audience in the middle of a face-to-face environment might be helpful. Did you have additional thoughts on that, Gwen?
Oh, no, I was going to just say I wanted to circle back to Travis's point about engaging youth with the yes/no conversation. We've learned with our teenage daughter, don't ask a question that is a yes or no answerable question if you want to stimulate the conversation, right? So, you know, we have to do leading questions when we're trying to work with kids to draw them out, type thing.
Great point. Yeah, if you want more than a grunt from a teenager, yes, no questions are not going to get it. Excellent. So what about using questions at the end? What have been your experiences with the Q&A session at the end of the presentation?
So I guess my experience has been, depending on the audience, sometimes there are questions related to what you covered, but then sometimes there are questions that sort of go beyond that. And sometimes I'm always conflicted as to, you sort of answer those as they're asked, but sometimes I feel like I'm going on and doing something else versus, well, we really didn't cover that. And I don't have a problem answering that question and kind of, digging into that. But I feel like, well, is everybody else thinking, well, I had a question about what we covered. So now are we past that point? So sometimes depending on the audience, I feel sort of conflicted as the presenter of how to handle those.
Yeah, especially those are times that we kind of get a little bit left field type questions, right? And it's an interesting time to think about how much of the entire group's time should I invest with this left field question in providing a response. One of the, let's see, Gwen mentioned the end of a presentation, the questions that we ask. That's a great place for reviewing the content, making sure that everybody is walking away with a clear understanding, that they don't have additional questions. And honestly, my question about Q&A at the end is a bit of a loaded question that you may have noticed or picked up on from my tone. A lot of times, if the only place that we create opportunity for our participants to ask questions is at the very end of a presentation during a Q&A, what we will get during that Q&A session is crickets, right? Because everyone has made the determination that this presenter clearly is not really interested in my engagement because they haven't set the context for that earlier. And I just want to get out of here because I'm done, right? Yes, exactly. Misty, thank you. The let's get out of here. The other thing, especially with youth audiences, is a peer pressure thing, right? And we've all been there. Remember the college class where it's a beautiful Friday afternoon and you're in class and the professor asks for questions at the end of class, and the dope in the front row raises a question that elicits a 5-minute response. Who likes that person? Ken, go ahead.
I was going to say, don't be that guy.
Yes, nobody wants to be that guy, right? Don't dare ask that question at the end of the session. But you change that dynamic very much if you build questions into the entire presentation. So my strong encouragement to you is don't just structure Q&A period at the end of presentations if you want participation. If your purpose is only sharing information and that's all you care about, then it's fine to do the Q&A session at the end. But if you want participation and engagement, you've got to build opportunities for interaction earlier than the last 15 minutes or the last 5 minutes. That can be a great time for review, though. The other thing that I would really encourage in the end of a presentation is to structure your own time so that you can be available for individual conversation. Because of that peer pressure to don't dare ask a question at the end. So making yourself available is also a good way, Travis, to kind of deal with that left field question, right? That maybe someone will just approach you with kind of a tertiary topic. Thoughts or reactions on this? Carrie says, if I use beginning and middle, then questions at the end tells me where I need to do better next time. Yeah, questions at the end are a great way to give you feedback for how do I need to tweak this presentation? Great. And Ken, thank you. At the end of a session is a good way for the presenter to pose the question to the group, not only for review, but also for the purpose of gathering good feedback. Debriefing and reflection, excellent. I'm preaching to the choir here, I can tell from the responses. And hopefully this is just some food for thought and some reminders for things that you already know, probably. So when I think about youth audiences, especially, but adult audiences as well, I think a lot about directed questions versus non-directed questions. Many of the questions that I have asked so far this morning have really been thrown out there for the whole group, right? And if I really was concerned about the fact that someone is really dominating the conversation, that would be one time to say, okay, I need to stop with the non-directed questions for a while, and I need to encourage specific other individuals to participate by directing a question to an individual. And you've been in those situations before, I'm sure, where you throw the question out for the group, the same person answers every question. And very often the person who does that is the person who is an external processor, right? They have to speak in order to process information. And it's important to recognize that there are people like that. So in order for them to learn, they have to be the one that gives the answer all the time. Some strategies to deal with that individual would be to encourage people to write a question down or to write a response down, rather than throwing the non-directed question out there and encouraging just verbal response from anywhere. Another thing to do when that one individual is kind of dominating the conversation is to really think about, and this is weird, and it doesn't apply in a Zoom situation, but the person on the front row who's always asking the question, if you're actually physically in a room with participants and you move to the opposite side of the room from where the first responder always is answering, and then you direct a question to someone in a different part of the room, that is kind of a subtle way to give a hint to that person in the opposite corner. You know, you're talking a lot here. And it's not a rude way of doing that. It's just a facilitation strategy to engage other parts of the room, make other people feel like they're getting your attention well. But let's get back to the directed question. Many of us have experienced times in our learning life where being the target of a directed question felt like punishment. You remember those grade school days? When you were maybe a little bit distracted or having a little chat or passing a note to somebody, and the teacher all of a sudden caught you in the middle of that and they directed a question to you. With adult audiences, that is incredibly belittling. Well, with youth audiences too. With any audience, that is an incredibly belittling sort of approach, and is a wonderful way to discourage participation or responses to future questions. So please don't ever use questions for the purpose of calling out negative behavior. There are better ways to do that than questions. Never use questions as punishment for any audience, unless you want to shut down all discussion and interaction. So there are right ways and wrong ways, though, to direct questions. And this is getting back to some phrasing. So here is obviously a non-directed question. And those of you who don't work with agricultural topics, forgive my agricultural bias with my examples. They're just ones that I think of. Obviously, an example of a non-directed question here. But an example of maybe a directed question would be to use a participant's name and then follow that up with a question. And I want to ask your thoughts on this strategy. I'll put out there that I don't think this is the ideal way to direct a question. Why would you, and this is a guess what I'm thinking question, I just realized it. Why do you think that is maybe a less effective way to use the participant name on the front end of the question?
Because everyone else shuts down when
Yeah.
you do that.
So I thank you, Ken, and thank you for guessing exactly what I was thinking very effectively. So yeah, when I call on Ken's name, everybody else just kind of does this mental, whew, I'm off the hook here, right? Another way to do that, and also, yes, Becky, that's another great point. When you use the name first, when you throw the name on the front end of the question, Mohammed very well may be in a situation where now he is panicked to the extent that I'm going to have to say something and I want it to sound intelligent, so much that he doesn't even hear and understand the question, right? And so that's another thing. Becky, thank you for raising that point. That is a great way to set Mohammed up for a situation where he's very uncomfortable saying anything. So another way to do that would be to ask the question, direct the question, and then in some way repeat the question. Repeating the question gives Mohammed's brain a little bit of time to kind of process, right? And he doesn't feel so much like he's on the spot. So thinking about ways to direct questions. Other reasons to direct questions are that it's just a good way to distribute the conversation in the room, right? It doesn't have to be that, you know, I'm reading nonverbal cues and I see someone who is suggesting to me that they want to give an answer. That's another good time, by the way, to direct a question. But we can, especially if we do this early on, if we distribute questions around the room or around the group early on, we set the stage and the context for the fact that we want everyone to be engaged here. All right. Other thoughts or reactions with directed or non-directed questions? Or maybe does someone have an experience they'd like to share, either positive or negative, about directed or non-directed questions that you've used in the past? Okay, we need to move on. So open and close questions. Just again, another reminder here. What's an example of what's a closed question? That's kind of intended as a bit of a pun. I just gave you one, right? A closed question is a question that has a single right answer. So a more open question would be, can you think of examples of when open-ended questions would be useful, right? So again, if we want engagement, if we want discussion, try to avoid closed questions, or at least reserve closed questions really for review type questions. If we want to encourage participation and engagement, more open-ended questions where there's not a single right answer or multiple answers that could be considered wrong, even worse, right? Open questions are going to encourage more engagement. Okay. Thinking about the cognitive level questions too is important. And I can't give a session thinking about instructional strategy without pulling some Bloom's taxonomy in here somewhere. But thinking about the level of cognition required is also a valuable way to think about encouraging engagement. So as a general rule, knowledge level questions, lower level questions, even if they're open-ended, lower level questions are less likely to get a response. Those kind of application and analysis type questions, if you want to encourage participation, ask, how would you apply this? What are your thoughts on these ideas? You know, those types of questions lend themselves to be very open, but also encourage your learners to internalize the content a little bit. And they're more likely to respond to those. conversely, really high level cognitive questions can be a little bit intimidating. So using a blend of different cognitive levels can be a good way to engage. So just a few examples to give a quick review of those. How would you classify this question? What are the pests you are currently working to manage on your grove? Is that an open or a closed? And is it lower level or higher level? How's that for a closed question to review? So I would say that one is an open-ended question, probably a lower level, right? Another example here, what can be done to prevent groundwater contamination? Well, it might depend on when and to whom the question is asked, right? But if you've really just started conversations about groundwater contamination, then okay, thanks, Jared. Thank you very much for sharing that evaluation, and I'm rambling long here. So thinking about that as an open and higher level question is what I was kind of throwing that out there as an example. What are the stages of cell division? Closed, lower level question. And then the last example I've got, given what you know about plant health, what would you say is wrong with this plant? Is probably a closed but higher level question. So there's a lot of different ways that you can combine cognitive level with open and closed. My question for you is, what are some of the things that you've thought about during our time together this morning that you want to try? And I know I've rushed here, especially at the end. What are some things that you were reminded that you want to try in your next session that you will be leading? Who can share an example? Okay, rephrasing directed questions. Yeah, thank you, Carrie, for throwing that out there. I really wish we were doing this in person. Other thoughts of ideas, or maybe not even things that this presentation stimulated, but also what are some additional suggestions or strategies that you've found to be effective with questions that you would share with the group?
Shannon, I'll share. I think you helped me realize I tend to ask very general questions. And so when you had the piece about asking a little bit more specific or that type, that I think I need to work on that more. So I appreciate that piece.
Thank you. Travis, thanks also for direct your questions with audience where you might not know the names, but can elicit responses from all areas of the room. So yeah, thinking about how do we deal with that environment where you don't know the individual? You know, you can ask, you can kind of gesture to someone and ask them to share their thoughts. You can simply make eye contact with someone, again, physically in the same room. That's a lot easier. And rephrase the question again. And then Andrea, thank you. I do think it's important, and one maybe walk away. Just remember to be intentional with questions, to think about as you're planning the presentation, think about what questions are going to be effective and where might you want to place them as well can be a great way. I know many of you have to run. Jared, what announcements do you have as we wrap up here? Thanks.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Washburn. Appreciate your time and energy to put into this presentation. We appreciate you all being here. I will just share that I did post in the evaluation link. I will do that one more time in case you missed it. Please give us your feedback and especially suggestions for future topics as we get ready to plan the future session or series of sessions. And please visit our webpage as well to register for our final session. It's on some retirement kind of strategies and information from Brian Raisin. And yeah, we'll see you in May. Thanks so much, everybody, and take care.
Have a great spring, everyone. Thank you.